I think that the fundamental message would be that the caliphate was at its greatest when it was at its most tolerant and multicultural.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Abbasid History Podcast. The Abbasid History Podcast is an audio platform for the community interested in the history of the pre-modern world. I'm your host, Talha Ahsan. The Abbasid Empire's height stretched from North Africa to modern-day India. Today with us to discuss the events and themes of this tremendous entity is arguably the world's leading authority on the subject, Professor Hugh Kennedy of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Welcome, Professor Kennedy.
Thank you.
Before we begin, Professor Kennedy, I'd like to know what led a young man in the 1970s to take such a keen interest in this topic of the Abbasids for his PhD. What was the state of scholarship like on early Islam and the pre-modern Islamic world at the time?
Actually, it was in the 1960s, and I first went to the Middle East in 1964, and I went to Damascus and Jerusalem, and I became aware of the enormous richness of the history of the area. And then, being interested in history generally, I came back to the UK and I found that the writing of the history of this period was very limited indeed. And I had the opportunity to live in Beirut, 1965, 1966, and did a course in Arabic at the school that was then run by the British Foreign Office at Shamlan outside of Beirut. And then I came back and studied Arabic and Persian and then history at Cambridge. And I did my final year of undergraduate work in the Department of History. And we were taught there very strictly to read historical sources and historical documents. We did it in those days in Latin because this was an English history subject. But it taught me, I think, to analyse historical sources in a very precise and, I hope, meaningful way. And then I went on to do research because my love was in the Middle Eastern history, and I've tried all my career to bring the methodologies, to bring the insights that you get from the close studies of sources from the Latin West to bear on the chronicles, documents and records of the Islamic Middle East in the Abbasid period. So why the Abbasids, you may ask? And even at that time, it struck me there was quite a lot of literature on the conquests, the Futuh, the early Islamic conquest, and then also on the Umayyads. But when it came to the Abbasids, there was virtually nothing. And there was no synthesis, there were very few guideposts to how you might look at it. And yet, it was clear from the very beginning, this was an immensely complex society that developed a very extensive literature of all different sorts on recording and analysing its details and so on. And it seemed to me the ideal thing to do research on.
I saw a video with Professor Cook, in which he described how his fellow historians often regarded his topic of subject of early Islam as something eccentric and a source of bemusement, especially as it was seemingly very scantily documented and quite obscure. But this was pre 9/11. How have you found there to be a kind of interest in your subject after 9/11?
There has clearly been a dramatic increase in the number of people studying early Islamic history and the way that it's done and so on. How far this is actually about 9/11, I'm not necessarily certain. I think it's partly to do with the large number of people of Middle Eastern heritage coming in, living in Western Europe and America, who brought with them their cultural interests and brought them into the academy. But the 9/11 was perhaps a spur, but I don't think it's the decisive thing. I think this was a movement that was underway before and gathered a pace afterwards. But it certainly is. The number of younger scholars who are working in this field now is just fantastic. I mean, it's really wonderful, the amount of interest and energy that this field is generating. The number of new approaches, the number of new ways of looking at things is difficult to keep up with in a way, but it is actually extremely exciting.
Okay, so if we go back to the beginning, we have this empire, which at its height stretched across this enormous geography. So let's begin here. What fermented this revolution against the Umayyads in the first place?
I think it was a feeling probably of, shall we say, disenfranchisement amongst a lot of Muslims in certain areas, particularly in Khorasan and northeast Iran generally. And the feeling that despite the protestations of the general ideology of the Ummah being an open society which people could navigate and, as it were, make their careers in fact, it had been taken over by a regionally based oligarchy, and that was the Umayyad state, and it was regionally based in Syria. So there's a regional thing but going on here, but there was also an anti-elitist thing, or at least anti-the Umayyad elite thing going on here. A widespread feeling that perhaps the promises of Islamic thought and ideology had not been delivered, and that there was a better way of doing things. And the better way of doing things, people were persuaded, was to look to the family of the Prophet Muhammad, whatever that meant, because that was not an easy question. The family of the Prophet Muhammad, and rule by the family of the Prophet Muhammad would lead to the beginning of a much more open, a much more Muslim society, which would admit people of all sorts of races and backgrounds.
And if we were to jump ahead a little, the downfall of the Abbasids is often marked by the Mongol onslaught, and some scholars have argued that their portrayed savagery is exaggerated. Notwithstanding that, how did it come about that this last caliph from this great pinnacle, they've reached this empire? How does it come about that the last caliph was apparently rolled up in a rug and stomped to death?
Well, we have to think that there are two phases of Abbasid history, and in a way that they're quite different. The first phase is the universal caliphate that starts in 749, 750, the Common Era, and lasts till about 940, 950 of the Common Era. And this was a period when the Abbasids had pretensions, and generally, in many cases, accepted to be the leaders of the entire Muslim Ummah. Then there is a period of great change with the coming of the Seljuks and so on, and the Abbasid Caliphate revives politically after about the year 1100, and it goes through to 1258. But it does so very much as a regional state. It's basically central Iraq, sometimes right down to the Gulf, but often not. It's basically a central Iraqi-based state. Now, along with that goes the idea that the caliphate is still essential for the survival of Muslim society. In Ghazali's great phrase, the caliphate is the tent pegs of our society. It keeps the whole edifice up. But in reality, the amount of leadership, the amount of power that the Abbasids had over areas that were not part of their own state was very, very small. And it's significant that the leadership of the Muslims against the Franks, the Crusaders, was taken not by the Abbasid caliphs but by Salah ad-Din and the Ayyubids. Equally, the resistance to the Mongols was not led by the Abbasid caliphs either. So So it's important to remember, I think, that you go from an imperial phase, if you like, to a much more regional monarchy phase that nonetheless has pretensions to some sort of, people are very divided about this, but some sort of universal relevance to the entire Muslim community.
Do you think we could describe the Abbasids, or the Abbasid caliphs, after the Mongol onslaught as something akin to a constitutional monarchy?
No, not after the Mongols.
During this period, they're like shadow caliphs to the Mamluks.
There are analogies, and you can find analogies in all sorts of different human societies of monarchies which have no power but nonetheless have relevance to the wider society. You can think of a constitutional monarchy in the Western European sense. You can look at the history of the Holy Roman Empire in the early modern period, where the Holy Roman Emperor was universally acknowledged but had no power, or at least universally acknowledged in Germany and parts of Italy, but had no effective power. And I think that the Abbasids were in that, had developed that sort of role.
Okay. A study of early Islam inevitably turns to the question of sources. And as you've just said, to understand claims to power, one needs to understand controversies regarding claims to succession after the death of the Prophet. I want to speak about why you disagree with the so-called revisionist school characterised by the works of the late Patricia Crone.
Well, I've been reading classical Arabic history texts, obviously, for a very long time now, and I fundamentally disagree with the Crone argument. And the Crone argument is basically that these are all written by Muslims who are in a sense committed to the cause, and they're essentially uncritical, firstly. Secondly, that there are so many disagreements in them that we can't believe anything they say, and that therefore Patricia Crone, at least in the early days, went on to suggesting this was a whole history of early Islam, or the world of early Islam as portrayed by the sources was in a sense a confection of the early Abbasid period to explain something that existed, but everyone had long since forgotten what it was about or how it had originated. And the third point was that if we want to understand what early Islam looked like, then we should look to sources that are outside the Islamic tradition. And so you look to Greek sources, which are pre-Meagher, Armenian writers, and so on, and so on, to get an outsider's view. And this seems to me, it seemed to me then, and it still seems to me now, to be a fundamentally mistaken point of view. It's true that the Islamic tradition has a great many contradictions in it. It's a huge body of evidence. Huge bodies of evidence always have contradictions in them. But it's very striking the way in which the body of historical evidence is not triumphalist, except marginally, in the sense of saying, this is the Islamic world is wonderful, we defeated all our enemies, and it's all, it's sweetness and light. The Islamic sources, early Islamic sources, dwell almost obsessively on divisions amongst Muslims. And if you read a source like Tabari's History of the Prophets and Kings, the vast majority of the material relates to disputes about how Islamic society has been organised and should be organised. Whereas if this was made up by later generations to explain something, they would surely have ironed out everything. Everything from the satanic verses to the endless disputes in Umayyad Iraq about this thing, to the struggles of the Abbasid revolution, to provincial rebellions, Shi'i rebellions, are covered in exhaustive detail. Struggles against the Byzantines, on the other hand, which is, as it were, the great jihad of early Islam, are often dismissed in a few sentences. The priority is not there. The priority of the historians is to work out how the Islamic community should be organize itself and how different people in the past have tried to work out the problems of this. So I think the idea that this is all a made-up fantasy is actually completely wrong. And it would be very nice if we could move on from that. We can be critical of the sources, like we would be critical of sources in any other area. People still read the Russian primary chronicle about the origins of Rus, despite the fact it was written 300 years after many of the events. Bede's History of the English People is written well after the events it describes about the foundation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the post-Roman period in Britain. But historians nonetheless take them seriously. They say, this is what we've got and we must understand it and work with it. And that's how I feel with the Islamic sources. Having said that as well, a lot of the material that there is this cliche that all the sources were written down 300 years after the events and so on and so forth. But in fact, a lot of the material embedded in those and edited into those sources are clearly much more ancient and much more directly related chronologically with the period they describe. And by unpicking this and by identifying these things, then I think we can get a very, not an uncritical, but in a sense a more positive view of what the early Islamic sources are trying to tell us, and a much more helpful one, frankly, in trying to understand what went on.
You look to Fred Donner as someone who's struck a very kind of healthy balance in approaching the sources. What is it about his works that you admire particularly?
Well, Fred's work is very closely based on a critical and respectful reading of the sources. His first great book, which is called The Early Islamic Conquests, I can't remember exactly what the title is now, was firmly grounded in close reading of the Arabic sources. I think in more recent years he's become perhaps more distanced from the close reading and attempting a wider interpretation and so on. But it is nonetheless firmly grounded in the early Arabic historical writings, which is, I believe, where we ought to start.
Let's turn to some specific themes you've written about. You have a book on the armies of the caliphs. What kind of military developments do we see during the Abbasid era in terms of technology or organisation?
The book about the armies is a lot concentrates extensively on political structures and about how the army is paid and what effects these have on society. But to go back to your first question, there's curiously little information in the early Arabic sources about exact military technologies, how battles were won, all those things that military historians really like about making maps about, the left wing coming in here and the right wing coming out and the cavalry coming up behind and so on. This is very, very difficult to reconstruct. Walter Kagi in his various books has attempted to reconstruct this, but frankly, it's not very convincing. The military technologies seem to be relatively static. Coats of mail are very important. Helmets are very important and very valuable. Military equipment is very valuable. And we find a lot about fighting and so on. People in early Islamic armies, people went into battle on horses and camels, but in the end they often end up fighting on foot. They got down and they fought on foot. What may be important, and I still don't completely understand this, I don't think anyone else does, is the invention of stirrups on horses, which seems a very sort of, an obvious thing. But in classical antiquity and up until around the year 700, horse riders did not have stirrups to put their feet in. In around that year, stirrups appear in battle narratives in the early Islamic period. And they're particularly connected possibly with the figure of Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra, the great commander who defeated the Kharijites in the time of the Umayyads. But we shouldn't perhaps put too much onto that. But the point about stirrups is that they give the mounted rider the stability to fight with swords on horseback, because people got off their horses, because without stirrups you can roll off. And I imagine, I've never fought on horseback, of course, obviously, and nor has anybody else we know ever done that. However, we can imagine these things. And the point about this is that the invention of stirrups and the spread of stirrups may have given cavalry the edge over infantry. The wars of conquest and wars of the Umayyad period were largely fought by infantry arranged in lines of battle. Sufuf is the Arabic word, often kneeling down with spears to resist a charge. By the 9th and 10th century, battles seem to be between groups of people on horses, and infantry are very much second-class citizens, or really not there at all. And I still think it's been controversial in history for a long, long time, but the invention of stirrups tilts the balance in favour of the mounted archer or the mounted cavalryman in warfare. So there is, I think, a change in technology. I've suggested that. I can't really prove it. But one result of this is that armies get much smaller. In the early Islamic conquests, we're talking about armies of 20, even 30,000. And I think this is entirely believable. There's no reason for it. By the time we get to the 10th century and the sort of crisis of the Abbasid caliphate, armies are never more than 5,000, really, and often there are a few hundred people. And so the whole numbers of the military declines dramatically. But on the second point, of course, that paying the army was what states did. And I've done sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations and so on to suggest that the budget of the Abbasid Caliphate, perhaps 70 to 80% of the money that was raised was spent on paying soldiers and the army. So that's a huge amount. This is what governments did. They collected money from taxpayers and paid an army to attack their enemies and defend themselves and so on. So the question of how is the military paid and so on becomes key to understanding how the state operated. Compared with the amount of money that was spent on the soldiers, the amount of money that was spent on, as it were, building mosques or building palaces or patronizing scholars and so on was marginal. It was a very small proportion of the main expenditure of the state.
Let's turn to some specific other themes you've written about. You have a remarkable essay on an epistle by Al-Jahiz on the comparative merits of homoerotic and heteroerotic practice.
Yes.
And I think what I found remarkable about your essay was for its kind of unredacted use of the C word and F word throughout.
Yes.
Without resort to any of that language, could you tell us about some of your observations about developing ideas of sexuality during the Abbasid period?
Well, I think what's interesting about the Jahiz essay is that it discusses the relative merits of basically boys and girls as sexual partners, and it's all written from an adult male point of view, of course. And it's curiously unjudgmental. It doesn't come down on one side or another. It is, at one sense, it's a literary sort of mufakhira, a literary boasting about these two different things. At another level, it's interesting because he is dealing with something that you would imagine to be completely taboo. At one level, particularly homoerotic practices, homosexuality, sodomy, are completely condemned. And yet, by Islamic law, and the penalties that are suggested are very fierce and very. On the other hand, it's treated as a subject for literary debate here. And since, this is a comparatively old article, but since I wrote that, there have been more studies, particularly studies of Mujun literature and so on, pointing out this curious paradox in much classical Arabic literature, that there is a clear legal abomination. Mujun literature concerns all sorts of irregular, by legal standards, sexual behaviour, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual or zina of all sorts. But it also concerns things like the drinking of wine and so on. And the Mujun literature openly discusses these in a non-judgmental way. Often they're the subject of jokes, they're the subject of boasting, the long lists of khamriyat, of wine poetry and so on. And the interesting paradox is, how does this go alongside a legal code and a legal structure which condemns these things absolutely and demands had punishments for all these sorts of activities? And yet these two, as it were, the cultural in terms of the legal and had punishment, well, the established culture seems to coexist with a counterculture which in a way celebrates these things, or at least regards them as subjects of interest and fun and poetry and jokes and so on. And so you get this curious ambivalence in this culture. And the discussions of Mujun literature, I'm thinking of Sultan Shombali's discussion of Mujun makes this point very clearly. And what I was doing in that essay, before the Mujun discussion really got going, was to point out this contradiction, as it seemed to me. And this contradiction that was pretty relevant in British culture up till the 1960s or so on. You've got this same disparity between people talking about gay relationships of one sort or another, and people were not well known for practicing, and a legal structure which made them illegal, and people got sent to prison and bad things happened. And so it's just an interesting societal thing, I think, and cultural identification discussion.
I think what I found most remarkable in the conclusion of your essay was how you felt that there was a category of the homosexual, that you felt there was an identity of the homosexual, whilst others would argue this is a relatively kind of modern construct in the understanding of sexualities.
Yes, I think that comes across from the sources. Now, lots of men did both, and that was considered to be quite a normal part of life. But there are people who are continuously described as luet, whatever they are, whatever the word is, as if it was part of their identity. Now, again, it's often difficult to know whether these things are part of a joke or part of a literary topos, or whether they reflect a real thing that's going on there. But there are all sorts of strange things that go. In the Abbasid caliphate, there was it's enormous amount of love poetry was written. And there's a lot, even from caliphs themselves, but generally about heterosexual love poetry, about the love for slave girls and so on, and the love for slave boys. And notoriously Abu Nuwas was interested in both. In later generations, in the later Abbasid period, this sort of love poetry disappears. And if prominent people do write love poems, they're always about boys and men. Heterosexual love poetry almost disappears from the caliphal canon and so on and so forth. And erotic love between males seems to be, in that society, the most, should we say the most elevated, is the love that is celebrated. And there's a very interesting example of these sorts of values in the story of the 10th century Buyid ruler, Izzad al-Bakhtiar, who was an unsuccessful ruler in all sorts of ways. And he lost his throne because, according to the great chronicler Miskawayh, because of his exaggerated and overindulgent love for a slave boy who he devoted all his time and energy to, and so on. But the interesting thing about this discussion in Miskawayh, who was a great ethicist, was not that the object of his affections was a boy rather than a girl, but he went over the top. It was his immoderate love for this young man that meant that he neglected the duties of state, he didn't lead his armies, he didn't pay attention to his viziers, and so on. So Miskawayh, who is an important moral thinker, is not condemning Izzad al-Bakhtiar because he is what we might call gay, but rather because he let his passions overwhelm his abilities or his needs as a statesman and so on. And I think that's quite an interesting perspective.
You have your book on the caliphate, and it's a subject which is now dominating the popular conscience increasingly. If I can put it like this, imagine if you were the policy advisor to ISIS. What would you have told them about the history of the caliphate? What do you think they ought to have known rather than what they imagined?
I think that the fundamental message would be that the caliphate was at its greatest when it was at its most tolerant and multicultural. I know that sounds like a very, very 21st century take on these things, but the caliphs in the Umayyad and Abbasid period did not, by and large, seek to interfere or dictate the religious beliefs of their subjects, whether they were different sorts of Muslims or whether they were non-Muslims. That was not the business of the rulers. The business of course, they took action against some religious thinkers, but only when they seemed to be a threat, a political threat, to the power of the dynasty. And in those cases, the reaction of the rulers was of course military and could result in arrests, persecution, and so on. But basically, how people conducted their own lives, as long as they didn't openly flout public morality and so on, was up to them. And now, there are stages like the famous Mihna, the Inquisition, that was set up by al-Ma'mun to discuss, and al-Ma'mun tried to lay down the idea that the doctrine of Khalq al-Quran, the doctrine of the createdness of the Quran, was going to be a state imposed, as it were, rule, and lots of people objected, but that was, in a way, an unusual, it was an aberration, and it only affected people who were engaged in state work. I mean, ordinary people, so to speak, could believe what they wanted, whatever they thought about Khalq al-Quran, and who knows about that. And there's another instance that's interesting in this respect, is that the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt come in as a small group of Ismailis from North Africa, and they rule Egypt in one of the most glorious caliphates there ever was in terms of its power and prestige and wealth and general. But they made no effort to convert or force the Sunni majority of Egypt to adhere to their religious beliefs. The Ismaili beliefs remained the belief of the ruling elite, the governing class, and the good people of Fustat, who were overwhelming, and other cities who were overwhelmingly Sunni, were just able to get on. They were able to hold their own services. They were going in the mosques. They were able to have their own feasts and things like that. So there was the caliphate worked because of this amount of give and take. And as long as you paid your taxes and you respected the authority of the caliph, then by and large you could do what you wanted to do. And on that level, the caliphate attracted the, if not enthusiastic allegiance, at least a passive acceptance by the vast majority of people.
As we come to the end, tell us about the state of scholarship on early Islam and the pre-modern world now, and tell us about some of the current projects that are taking place and the way you see things heading.
There are so many different and exciting and new ways of looking at things. There are new ways of looking at sources. There is, and something I'm engaged in very much at the moment myself, an increasing interest in the economic foundations of the Islamic world. There's equally the development of Sharia, and almost everywhere you look, there are important new developments. What I still, because this is the background I come from and the way I approach things, I think is underdeveloped, is, as it were, the nitty-gritty of political discussion and political history, and the way in which this political society works. And we're still, in books and so on, stuck with this idea of the caliph as an absolute ruler and so on and so forth, whereas all historical periods suggest that no rulers are ever absolute. There's always a constituency that backs them up. And if you want to understand politics, you have to look at who these people are. And that leads into prosopographical analysis, who is doing what, who is supporting the ruler, and so on. And that sort of mainstream political history, which I love, and which I think is very important to our understanding, has, in a sense, been neglected, perhaps, in favour of more different sorts of cultural history and economic history and so on. But there are wonderful things going on all the time. I'm finding out about new books, and I'm trying to read at least some of them, but I'm finding out about new books and new approaches and so on. It's a very vibrant and exciting field at the moment. And
before we end, tell us about your forthcoming translation, Al-Baladhuri, which is on pre-order on Amazon.
It's some way off appearing on the airport bookstall, so to speak. The Baladhuri Futuh al-Buldan is the great chronicle of the early Islamic conquest. It's been used by historians for a very long time. It was translated into English by Philip Hitti and Francis McGotten in around the year 1920. And it was quite well translated. It's a good and accurate translation in the main. But this chronicle, it consists of descriptions of battles, which are pretty uninteresting, but a lot of information about property ownership, property law, irrigation, and so on in the early Islamic society. And what I want to do in this translation is do a proper historical and philological commentary on this, which Hitti and McGotten did virtually no commentary at all. And in order to do that, I have to have a translation which I can agree with, because certain key words, I think, words for property ownership and so on, they gave a misleading translation for. So I need to do my own translation, which is very good for my Arabic. Baladhuri is it's very fine Kitaba Arabic, and it's the most Fusha Arabic, so to speak, and that makes it very intriguing. But it's also got all these other elements to it, and so that's what I'm going to try to do. But it'll be a while.
Professor Kennedy, thank you for being our first guest.
Thank you. That's a pleasure.